11 seconds. That is all the ancient oath demands. Somewhere between the first time and the 40th, 11 seconds stopped being enough for them both. We begin this story now. The rain had been falling on Wiltshire for 9 days, and the gates of Malfoy Manor wore it badly. Hermione Granger stood before them with her satchel strap cutting a wet line across her shoulder, and told herself, for the 4th time since the apparition point, that a building was only a building. Stone and lime mortar. Iron that had rusted at the hinges like anyone's iron. The peacocks were gone, sold or dead, or simply too sensible to stay. And in their place, the lawn had gone to seed, tall and colourless, bending under the weather in long grey waves. 3 years. She had promised herself never, and she had meant it with her whole body. And now here she was with the rain finding the gap between her collar and her neck, waiting to be let in. The gate recognised her before anyone else did. The wrought iron gave a low shudder, a sound like a swallowed word, and the serpentine scrollwork at its centre unwound itself and drew back. Nobody came down the drive to meet her. She walked it alone, gravel giving under her boots with a sound like teeth on shell, and she kept her eyes fixed high, on the roofline, on the chimneys, on the wet black lace of the elms, because she had learned that the trick was to look above the thing you were afraid of. He was waiting in the doorway. Of course he was. He would have known the moment the gate moved. Granger. Malfoy. 3 years had taken the last of the softness out of his face and given him nothing in exchange. He was thinner than the boy she remembered, and better dressed than the man she'd expected, in dark wool with no ornament at all, except the ring, the heavy silver signet on his right hand, which caught the poor light and held it. He did not offer to take her cloak. He did not offer his hand. He stood aside, and she came in out of the rain, and the door closed behind her with the deep, hollow finality of a hand laid over a bell. The entrance hall smelled of cold ash and old beeswax. Somewhere above them, high in the ceiling's dark, water was working at the plaster with a slow, patient tap. The ministry's letter said 3 weeks, he said. The ministry's letter was optimistic. It's 6, possibly 7. She wiped her palms once, briskly, against her cloak, and hated herself for needing to. The reparations bill covers property seizures back to 1610. Half the transfers were never registered with the ministry because the families involved didn't recognize the ministry's authority over land they'd held since the conquest. There are 4 private archives in Britain with the original conveyances. 3 of them have burned. And the 4th is mine. The 4th is yours. He looked at her for a moment longer than the sentence required. She had the distinct impression of being read the way she read a document, not for what it said, but for what had been struck out. This way, he said. The corridor ran west, into the older part of the house, and the further they went, the more the building changed its accent. The Georgian plaster gave way to panelling gone black with age. The floor stopped being marble and became flagstone, uneven, dished in the middle by 6 centuries of feet. Their footsteps came back at them from somewhere ahead and to the left, in rooms she couldn't see, which was a property of the place she remembered too well and had never wanted to remember at all. She did not look at the doors they passed. She had a very precise sense of where the drawing room lay in relation to the front hall. She had carried that geometry in her body for 3 years, the way one carries the memory of a burn. And she counted her steps and did not look. Draco Malfoy stopped at the end of the passage before a door that did not belong to the rest of the house. It was low and broad, and made of oak so old it had gone the colour and nearly the hardness of iron, and there was no handle on it anywhere. Bands of black metal crossed it in a pattern that hurt slightly to follow. Set into the wood at eye height was a disc of pale stone, unmarked. The archive, he said. She could feel it. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated, that the wards would have a texture. The air in front of the door was denser, faintly charged, and it made the small hairs on her forearms lift and settle like a field of grain under wind. Beneath the smell of damp stone, there was something sharper, scorched air, the tang that lingers after a hex has gone past your ear. Open it then. He didn't move. It isn't locked, Granger. It's sealed. There's a difference. He gestured at the disc of stone with 2 fingers, unhurried. It admits the blood of the house without asking. Everyone else, it asks. Then let it ask. You misunderstand me. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth and was gone. It doesn't ask you. It asks me. He set his palm flat against the stone. The disc warmed under his hand. She watched it flush the dull orange of a coal breathed on, and the door made a sound like a very old man drawing breath, and swung inward perhaps 4 inches, and stopped. Cold air came out. It carried dust and vellum and the ghost of cedar oil, and something underneath that she couldn't name, dry and mineral, the smell of a space that had not held weather in a long time. Hermione stepped forward. The air went solid. It was not a wall, and it was not a hand. It was more like walking into deep water at speed, a pressure that met her everywhere at once, and pushed with the calm indifference of something that had been doing this since before her language existed. She rocked back on her heels, breath knocked crooked, and the door pulled itself shut with a soft, dismissive thud. Yes, said Draco. It does that. She straightened her cuff. Both cuffs. She was aware of doing it and could not stop. The oath, she said. There's an oath. Halvard's Register of Northern Bindings, 6th Appendix. The Norse houses brought the ward north to south with the Danelaw settlements. The owner swears the guest in and swears them out again. Daily, if it's a daily entry. She heard her own voice going faster and flatter, the way it did when she was steadying herself on facts. You must have the text. I have the text. Then get it. He looked at her for a long moment in the dim of that corridor. Water tapping somewhere overhead, and she could not tell what he was weighing. Then he reached into his coat and produced a strip of parchment, folded once, that had clearly been on his person since before she arrived. He had known. He had read it that morning. He had stood in this passage and read it and put it in his pocket and gone to meet her at the door with nothing on his face at all. She took it. The parchment was old enough to have a grain to it, a roughness like the tooth of unsized paper, and the ink had gone the brown of dried tea. The Norse was cramped, the runes half-transitional, the whole thing copied by someone with cold hands. She read it once. She read it again. Legdu hund tina a hjarta eidsvarans, she said aloud slowly. It's approximate, Draco said. The idiom doesn't carry. It carries perfectly. Hjarta, heart. In the broader construction, it means the chest, the trunk, the... His hand made a small economical motion in the air, sketching a region rather than a place. The general area, shoulder to sternum. Norse is imprecise about anatomy. It's a language for people who are mostly interested in the outside of other people's bodies. Hermione lifted her eyes from the parchment and looked at him. You're lying. I'm translating. Malfoy. I read Old Norse. Badly, I imagine. Fluently, she said. As of my second year of runic studies, and hjarta is not a vague word, it is one of about 11 words in the entire corpus that is never vague, because they used it in blood oaths, which are the one context in which a Norseman would rather die than be misunderstood. She stopped, breathed. Put your hand where the text says, and open the door. Something moved behind his face. Not amusement. She would have known what to do with amusement. Fine, he said. He stepped closer. She held her ground, which took more than she expected. The corridor was narrow, and he was suddenly not a figure at the end of it, but a person, near, smelling faintly of cold wool and bergamot, close enough that she could see the rain still beaded in the pale of his hair. He raised his right hand. The signet caught the light again. He set his palm high on her shoulder, flat against the collarbone, and spoke the oath. The words came out of him low and unhurried, in a tongue that had not been spoken in this house for 800 years, and the corridor changed shape around them, the pressure of the wards drawing in, the charged air tightening, the disk of stone in the door beginning to glow. Then it stopped. The light died. The pressure released all at once with a small sound, like a held breath let go. And somewhere in the wood of the door something snapped, sharp as a struck flint, and the whole passage went utterly still. Rejected. Neither of them moved. His hand was still on her shoulder, entirely correct, entirely useless, and she watched the certainty go out of his face, and something much more complicated arrive in its place. Right, Hermione said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that later. So, lower. His hand did not move. His eyes did, down and back up, fast, as though the glance had been a mistake he was already correcting. Granger. Lower, Malfoy. The text says heart. The heart is not in the shoulder. You have been standing in this corridor for the last 5 minutes, hoping the oldest wards in Wiltshire would accept a compromise, and they have not. And now you and I are going to have a conversation about what happens next. She folded the parchment along its old crease, once, very precisely, and held it out to him between 2 fingers. And before your hand goes anywhere at all, we are going to have that conversation in writing. He did not take the parchment. In writing, he repeated. In writing. You want me to fill out a form. I want you to fill out Form 12-B, which governs incidental physical contact in the course of ministry-sanctioned research. And I want the accompanying consent in triplicate. 1 copy for you, 1 for me, 1 for the Department of Magical Antiquities. And I want both of us to sign and date every one of them. She was still holding out the parchment. Her hand was perfectly steady, which struck her as a small private miracle. And then you may put your hand on my chest and open the door, and we will both go about our business like adults. The corridor did what corridors in that house did, which was carry the silence somewhere else and hand it back a moment later, slightly worse. You're serious, Draco said. I am always serious. It's my defining flaw. Ask anyone. Granger, it's a... He stopped, started again, more carefully, which he noted. It's 4 seconds of an oath in a dead language. The wards don't care about paperwork. The wards were laid down by people who thought a signature was something you burned into a man's arm. The wards don't care. I care. And there it was, a half-inch too much heat in it, a crack showing at the edge of the word. She heard it. He heard it. She saw him hear it, saw the flick of his attention like a hound lifting its head at a sound too high for people. And she despised the whole architecture of her own body for giving her away in a house like this one. She lowered her hand, folded the parchment a second time, put it in her own pocket, because she was not going to stand there offering it to a man who wouldn't take it. You may find it absurd, she said. You are welcome to find it absurd. But I am going to walk through that door every day for 6 weeks, twice a day, which by my arithmetic is somewhere in the region of 84 occasions on which you will have your hand on me. And I would like it on record, in a filing cabinet in London, with a stamp on it, precisely what that is, and precisely what it is not. The rain went on tapping in the ceiling. Somewhere far off in the house, a shutter worked itself loose and knocked twice against stone. Draco Malfoy looked at her for the length of 3 of those knocks, and whatever it was that crossed his face. She thought about it that night, lying awake in a cold inn in Marlborough, with her wand under the pillow out of pure habit. And she could not decide whether it had been offence, or comprehension, or something that had gone past both of those and arrived somewhere she had no map for. Very well, he said. Where does one obtain a Form 12B? Level 2, 4th window. It's a green form. Ask for the annex as well. The annex is separate, and they won't tell you that unless you ask. The annex. Schedule 4. Duration and frequency of contact. She shouldered her satchel. I'll be here at 9 tomorrow. You've come all the way from London? Yes. And you're going to leave without opening the door? Yes, said Hermione, and walked back down the corridor past all the doors she did not look at, and out through the hall and into the rain, which had not stopped and would not stop for another 4 days. He was in the doorway again at 9, and this time he had a folder. It was leather. Of course it was leather, oxblood and softened at the corners, the sort of thing that had held deeds and marriage settlements and possibly a war. He handed it to her on the front step without a word, in the wet, and she had to put her satchel down on the flags to open it. Form 12-B completed. The consent in triplicate on 3 separate sheets, each one signed. Schedule 4 filled in with dates. The 12th of October to the 23rd of November, twice daily, 1 entry and 1 egress. A covering letter to the Department of Magical Antiquities. A second covering letter, unrequested, to the Wizengamot Committee on Historic Records, noting that the applicant was granting access to a private archive of the 2nd class and waiving the customary indemnity. And his handwriting. That was the thing she had not been prepared for and could not afterwards get out of her head. It was a beautiful hand, narrow, upright, ferociously even, the loops closed and the crossbars laid down like rulers. And it did not vary by a hair from the first line to the last, not on the 5th page, not on the 15th. Nobody wrote like that unless something in them had once depended on it. She turned to the third page and found the box marked Nature of Contact and stopped breathing for a moment in the rain. Nature of Contact. Official business. "You've done the annex," she said, when she could. "I asked for it, as instructed. You've done the annex twice. The second copy's for you to keep at the ministry. I assumed you'd want one that hadn't been in a Malfoy's pocket." She looked up. His face gave her nothing at all. The rain had darkened the shoulders of his coat, and he stood there with his hands behind his back, like a man waiting to be inspected. And she thought, with a clarity that unsettled her far more than the paperwork, he has been awake since 5 doing this. "Right," she said. "Well, good. You may check the dates." "I will check the dates. I've no doubt." She checked the dates. They were correct. She closed the folder and picked up her satchel and followed him in. The corridor was colder than it had been the day before. The ward pressure met them 10 feet out. That faint charge, that lifting of the hair on her arms, the smell of scorched air riding under the damp. They stopped in front of the black oak. He set his palm to the stone disc. It flushed. The door gave 4 inches and stopped, exactly as before, and the cold breath of the archive came out at them, carrying vellum dust and cedar. Then neither of them moved. Hermione became aware that she was standing with her arms at her sides in an attitude of parade ground stiffness, and that her chin was up, and that she was staring fixedly at a point on the wall 6 inches to the left of his ear, where the panelling had been patched at some point in the last century with a slightly wrong shade of oak. "Granger." "Yes." "I'm going to..." "Yes. I know. Do it." "I'm going to put my hand..." "I know, Malfoy. I filled in the form. I know precisely what you are going to do. You have documented it in triplicate." "I'm telling you," he said, "because I would rather you knew a second before than a second after." That shut her up. She turned her head and looked at him properly. He was not smirking. There was nothing in his face she could use, no edge to push back against, only a kind of careful attention that she found she could not hold for long, and so she looked back at the wrong-coloured patch of panelling and said quietly, "All right. Thank you. Go on." He raised his hand. There was a moment, no longer than a breath, where it hovered, and she could feel the warmth of it before the touch, the small displaced heat of a palm at an inch's distance, and every nerve in her chest gathered itself under that inch and waited. Then his hand settled, and his fingers were spread flat, and beneath the wool of her jumper and the cotton under it, his palm lay directly over her heart, and her heart, traitor, animal, hopeless thing, bolted. He would feel it. That was the arithmetic she had failed to do. Of all the calculations she had made in the last 18 hours, all the schedules and clauses and indemnities, she had somehow not performed the simple one, that a hand laid over a heart is a hand laid on the truth, and hers was going like a bird in a hedge, and he would feel every beat of it. He did not react. He did not so much as breathe differently. He spoke the oath. "Ex vervidjörd och stein och blod." His voice went low for it. Not theatrical, the opposite, flattened almost to nothing, the way people speak in a chapel. The Norse came out of him with a fluency that she filed away furiously to be furious about later, and the corridor drew in around them, and the pressure that had thrown her back the day before came close and gathered and did not push. She was aware of things in a strange, disordered order. The cold of the signet ring, a hard little bite of silver against her sternum, entirely out of keeping with the warmth around it. The 3 inches of air between his coat and her shoulder that neither of them crossed. Her own breath, which had gone shallow and useless. The particular way he was looking at the door, and only at the door, fixedly, with the discipline of a man walking a narrow ledge. Okej vid hjarta eidsvarans, at hon fari in och ut I fridi. 11 seconds. She counted them, because counting was what she had. The stone disc went from orange to white. The door groaned on its hinges and swung wide, and the whole weight of the wards released at once with a soundless concussion she felt in her back teeth. His hand came away. It came away quickly, not a snatch, nothing so undignified, but faster than it had gone on, and he stepped back and put both hands behind him again and said to the doorway, "You'll want a light. The sconces don't take incendio, they take the old word. Kvike. Say it as though you mean it, and they'll manage." "Kvike," Hermione said. Her voice was almost entirely her own. Down the length of the archive, one after another in a long, shuddering cascade, the sconces woke. She had prepared herself for shelves. She had not prepared herself for the vault. A low barrel of stone running 70 feet under the west wing, ribbed like the inside of a hull, every rib carrying racks that went from flagstone to ceiling. Deed boxes, rolled charters with their seals hanging off them, in wax the colour of dried blood. Ledgers a yard high. The air was bone dry and utterly still, and had the mineral hush of a place with no weather in it, and it smelled of vellum and cedar oil, and, very faintly, of ozone, as though something had discharged in here a long time ago, and never quite finished. "Merlin," she said. "Quite." He was still in the doorway. He did not come in. "The land conveyances are the 3rd bay on the left. The seizures you'll want are indexed by year and then by county, which is idiotic, because half of them were seized under one name and registered under another. There's a concordance. It's the green book on the end stand. My great-grandfather made it, and he was a pedant and a bigot, but he was accurate." Hermione turned round. He was framed in the low black doorway with the corridor dark behind him, and he had said all that without hesitation, which meant he had been down here. Recently. He had come down into this vault at some point in the last day and a half, and looked at the 3rd bay on the left, and found the concordance, and worked out what she would need. "You're not coming in," she said. "You didn't file a form for that." "Malfoy, I'll be in the house. There's a bell pull at the far end by the stair. Give it 2 pulls and I'll come and swear you out." He paused, and for a moment something almost like humour surfaced and sank again. "Don't try to walk out on your own. It won't hurt you. It will simply decline to let you leave, and you'll spend the afternoon shouting at a door, and I shall have to pretend I can't hear you." How reassuring. I aim to reassure. He turned to go, then stopped, one hand on the frame, and did not look back at her. "Granger, the date's on Schedule 4. If the 6 weeks run long, if you need a 7th or an 8th, you needn't apply again. I'll sign whatever extension you put in front of me." A beat. I only mention it so you don't spend a fortnight being brave about it." And he was gone up the passage before she could assemble a single word, his footsteps going hollow and then faint and then nothing at all. And Hermione Granger stood alone in 800 years of the Malfoy family's paper, with her hand pressed flat over her own sternum, where the cold of a silver ring was still, unaccountably, refusing to fade. The routine established itself the way weather does, without announcement, without anyone agreeing to it, simply arriving one morning fully formed and behaving as though it had always been there. 9 o'clock. She came up the drive with her satchel and her boots ruining themselves on the gravel. And he was in the doorway, and neither of them said good morning, because good morning was a thing that would have had to be decided on, and neither of them was going to be the one to decide it. Down the west passage, the pressure gathering. His palm on the stone, the disc going coal red, the door giving its 4 inches and stopping. Then the pause. The pause was the part she could not get used to. 10 days in, 20 days in, she still could not get used to the pause. That small suspended interval in which he lifted his hand and held it a breath away and said nothing. And she gave the smallest nod she was capable of giving, and only then did he close the distance. He had never once skipped it. He had never once let his hand simply arrive. Ek sver vid jord, ok stein, oke blod. She had stopped counting the seconds by the 8th day, because counting had begun to feel like a thing she was doing in order to have something to do with the fact that she did not mind. That was the sentence she could not get past. She did not mind. She turned it over on the walk back to the apparition point each evening, examining it from every angle, the way she would examine a clause with a suspicious sub-paragraph. She did not mind. It was not that she endured it, or tolerated it, or had grown numb to it. It was that at some point between the 4th day and the 11th, the 11 seconds had stopped being a toll she paid to get into the archive, and had become something with its own shape, its own weight in the day, a fixed point she found herself walking towards. She wrote in her notebook one night, in the cold inn at Marlborough, "Habituation to a stimulus reduces response. Standard, non-remarkable." Then, under it, in smaller letters, because she was a person constitutionally incapable of leaving a false statement on a page, "This is not what is happening." Her heart did not slow down. 21 days in, it still went off like a startled thing under his palm, every single time. And by now, he must know it, must have known it from the first morning, and he had never given the smallest sign. That was its own species of cruelty and its own species of mercy, and she had not worked out which. The work, at least, was extraordinary. She had expected a family archive, self-congratulation in vellum, portraits of holdings, the same 6 surnames marrying one another for 400 years. There was all of that. But underneath it, there was the other thing, the thing she had come for. And it was worse and richer than the ministry's records had let her imagine. The conveyances told the truth, because they had never been meant to be read by anyone outside the house. A Muggle-born family's farmstead in Cumbria, 1683, transferred for a consideration of 9 galleons. The entire freehold, 80 acres, worth 200 at the least. A charter of 1721, in which 4 Kentish smallholdings simply changed hands, with no consideration recorded at all, only a marginal note in a clerk's hand. By consent of the parties, no writing required. She had spent an hour with that one. No writing required. It was the most efficient sentence about theft she had ever read. She worked with 2 lamps and the concordance and a cramped, freezing hand, and the vault's dry air made her lips crack and her nose bleed twice in the first fortnight, and she did not care. She was building something. Every day the stack of copied transcriptions on the end stand got taller, and every day the map in her head of what had actually been done to people over 3 centuries got more precise, and precision was the only revenge the law permitted. He came down at 1 o'clock with a tray. That had started on the 5th day, and neither of them had discussed it either. It was never anything elaborate. Bread, cheese, an apple, a pot of tea under a cosy that had been darned. He set it on the end stand, said something brief and usually barbed, and went away again. On the 9th day, the tray had a second cup on it, and he had stayed 11 minutes. On the 15th, he had stayed 40, and they had argued about the statute of secrecy's effect on inheritance law, until she realized the tea had gone stone cold, and he had a smear of dust along one cheekbone from leaning on a rack. He knew the archive. That was the other thing she had not expected. He knew where everything was. He knew the hands of 5 generations of family clerks on site. He could date a charter to within a decade from the wax alone. And he did it all in the flat, unadorned way of a man passing on information he would rather not be found to possess. "You've read all of this," she said, on the 18th day. "Some of it. Malfoy, you knew the 1683 Cumberland deed was misfiled under Westmoreland. You knew that before I found it. You've read all of this." He turned the apple over in his hand and did not eat it. "There was a period," he said, "of about 2 years after the trials when I was not permitted to leave the house. Not by anyone's law. There was simply nowhere I could go where I would not be." A small motion of the fingers, dismissing the rest of the sentence. "And my mother was in France. So, yes, I read all of this." He put the apple down on the tray, uneaten, and left, and she sat with her quill dry in her hand for a long time. The row came on the 21st day, and it came, as such things do, over something that did not deserve it. She had found the Ashworth papers, 1798, Herefordshire. 212 acres and a mill, held by a family called Ashworth, half-blood on the mother's side, wizarding for 6 generations without a single entry in any registry, because nobody had ever bothered to enter them. There had been a dispute over a boundary hedge. There had been a magistrate. And then there had been an instrument of conveyance dated the 4th of March, executed with what the parchment called the free assent of Thomas Ashworth. And Thomas Ashworth's signature was a cross, and beneath the cross a clerk had written his mark. And beside the clerk's note, in a different ink, in a hand she had learned to recognize across 4 decades of documents, was a single word in the margin: compliant. She was still holding it when Draco came down with the tray. "Explain this." "Good afternoon to you as well." "Explain this." She had come off her stool and crossed the flagstones with the sheet held up between them, and she heard how her voice was carrying down the vault, coming back off the ribbed stone, flattened and doubled. Thomas Ashworth signed with a cross. He couldn't write his name. 212 acres and a working mill, and he signed with a cross, and your great-great-grandfather wrote compliant in the margin like a note on a horse. Draco set the tray down, very carefully, so that nothing on it rang. I know the Ashworth conveyance. Then explain it. What would you like me to say? He straightened, and there was something new in his face now, something with edges. That it was theft. It was theft. Would you like it in writing? You've developed rather a taste for having things in writing. Don't. Then don't stand in my family's archive and demand I perform contrition on cue at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. His hand had gone to the edge of the stand, and the knuckles had gone white along the ridge, 4 small bloodless points, and she watched them and could not look away from them. You have had a fortnight of my documents and my tea and my Norse. What precisely am I to explain? I was not there. I am not sorry in a way that helps. I have never once in 3 years found a form of words for it that did not make it worse in the saying, and you of all people should understand that a bad apology is only theft of a second kind. It takes the thing, and then it takes your right to be angry about the thing as well. The vault held the silence and gave it back. Somewhere in the racks, a mouse or a wardstone or a settling beam made a small dry sound. Hermione lowered the parchment. That's the first honest thing you've said in 3 weeks, she said. I've said nothing dishonest. You've said nothing at all, Malfoy. You've said tea, and the sconces don't take incendio, and the concordance is the green book. You've handed me 3 centuries of your family's crimes with both hands, and stood in the doorway while I read them, and never once come inside. She was shaking. She noticed it distantly, the way one notices weather through a window. Why do you never come in? He looked at her. Because you're in here, he said. It went through her the way the ward pressure had gone through her on the first day. A change in the density of the air, everything meeting her at once. And I thought, he went on, and now he was speaking very carefully, laying each word down flat like his handwriting, that 6 weeks in a stone room with the man from that house would be more than enough, without him also being at your elbow while you read the ledgers. So, I go upstairs, and I wait for the bell. That is the whole of the mystery. She could not make her voice work for a moment. The tray, she managed. What about it? You come down with a tray every day. You forget to eat, Draco said, and it puts you in a foul temper, and then I have to swear you out of a locked room while you're in it. Call it self-interest. He said it lightly. He did not look at her while he said it. And Hermione stood there with the Ashworth conveyance hanging from her fingers, and understood, with the sudden, clean horror of a mistake caught too late, that she had spent 21 days building a very careful structure out of green forms and triplicate copies and Schedule 4, and that the structure had been load-bearing, and that a single unguarded sentence about a tray had just taken out the wall. I'm going to keep the Ashworth papers out, she said, because it was the only thing left standing. For the transcript, I'll need them again tomorrow. Keep them out. I'm not apologizing for shouting. I should think not. You were right to. I don't need you to tell me I was right to. No, he agreed. You never have. He picked up the tray with the untouched food on it. He had brought 2 cups again, she saw. He had been bringing 2 cups since the 9th day and had never once mentioned it. And he went back up the vault towards the low black door, and she watched him go, and at the threshold he stopped. 4 o'clock? 4 o'clock. I'll be there. And at 4 o'clock he was, as he was every day, and she came out of the dry stone cold into the passage and stood in front of him, and he lifted his hand and held it that inch away and waited for her nod, as he had waited on every one of the last 21 afternoons. But this time, when she gave it, and when his palms settled over her heart, and the ring bit its small cold half-moon into her sternum, and the Norse began, Hermione did not look at the wrong-coloured patch of panelling 6 inches to the left of his ear. She looked at him, and after a moment, without breaking a syllable of an oath 800 years old, he looked back. She took the wrong turning on a Tuesday. It was nobody's fault, which was the intolerable part. She had gone up early. The concordance had a supplement, and the supplement was not in the vault, but in a reading room on the ground floor, and Draco had set second door past the long window, the one with the barometer, and she had counted doors, and the house had counted differently. The corridor she came out into was wider. The floor went back to marble. And she knew, 3 steps in, with a knowledge that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the body's own filthy filing system, exactly where she was. The double doors stood open. There was no reason for them to be open. There was no reason for her to look. She looked. It was empty. Not emptied recently. Emptied. The room had been stripped down to its bones. No carpet. No long table. No high-backed chairs. No cabinet. No chandelier. Only the hook in the ceiling where a chandelier had been, and a great pale rectangle on the parquet, sun-faded at its border, where something enormous had lain for 200 years and been taken away. The windows were unshuttered. The light came in flat and grey and lay on bare boards and went nowhere, because there was nothing left in the room for light to do. Hermione stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and could not make herself move in either direction. Her forearm had begun to sing. That was the word for it, though she had never said it to anyone. Not to Harry, not to Ginny, not to the mind healer at St. Mungo's, who had been kind and useless in equal measure. A high, thin, cold note under the skin where the letters were, that came without warning and had nothing to do with pain. It sang now. She pressed her other hand over her sleeve, hard, and stared at the pale rectangle on the floor and made herself catalogue it. 17 feet by 12. Aubusson, probably. The fade is even so it was never moved, because cataloguing was a thing she could do, and screaming was not. She did not hear him come. She never heard him come. The man walked like weather. Granger. She did not turn round. She could not, in that particular second, arrange her face into anything a person could be shown. There was a pause behind her. It went on long enough that she thought, with a lurch of something like relief, that he had gone away again. Then he said, "The floor's original, 1640. It's the only thing in the room I couldn't have taken out." She turned. He was standing 3 yards back, not close, deliberately not close, with his hands at his sides, and no expression she could put a name to. The grey light did him no favours. He looked like a man who had been up since 5 for 6 weeks running. "You took it all out," she said. Yes. When? The spring after the trials. He looked past her, into the room, at the hook in the ceiling. It went to a sale room in Salisbury. They asked what provenance to put in the catalogue, and I told them to put a private collection, Wiltshire, and the man asked whether I wouldn't get more for it with the name attached, and I said no, and he thought I was a fool, and he was probably right. The carpet alone would have gone for 400 with the name on it. Where's the money? Ministry Reparations Fund. Anonymous. There's a receipt somewhere in the vault, third bay under charitable dispositions. A very slight movement of one shoulder. I filed it correctly. You'd approve of the filing. Hermione discovered that she was crying, which was outrageous, and which she dealt with by wiping her face once with the heel of her hand, as though brushing off rain. "Don't," she said. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Give me a sum. Give me a receipt. As though there's a number. As though somewhere in the world there's a figure that—" Her voice went. She got it back. "You cannot buy this off, Malfoy." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I couldn't burn the house down," Draco said. "And I couldn't leave it, and there was a room in it where a woman had been tortured on the floor, and I had to do something every single day or go mad, and taking the furniture out was the something I could reach." He said it in the same flat voice he used for wax dating, and Norse and the price of tea. "It doesn't buy anything. It doesn't undo an hour of it. It was never meant to. It was the only motion available to a man with no useful options, and I made it. And if you want to tell me it was cowardly and insufficient, I'll agree with you, and it will still have been the only thing I did in that entire year that let me sleep." The house ticked around them. Somewhere the loose shutter knocked. "I keep the doors open," he said. "That's the other thing. I keep them open because the one time I shut them, I found myself standing in the corridor at 4 in the morning with my hand on the handle, not opening them, and I decided I would rather have a room I have to walk past than a door I have to not open." Hermione looked at the pale rectangle on the parquet for a long moment. "There was a chandelier," she said. "There was. It fell." "Yes. I've never told anyone that part, that it fell at the end, and I thought—" She stopped, started again. "It doesn't matter what I thought." "It matters," said Draco. "Don't. Granger, don't," she said. "Be kind to me in this room. I can't—" And her hand made a small wild gesture that took in the bare boards and the ceiling hook and 3 years of her own careful architecture. "Anywhere else. Not here. Not here, please." He nodded once, immediately, and stepped back out of the doorway. "Second door past the long window," he said, "is on the other side of the barometer. I said it badly. That's my error, not yours." He was already turning away, giving her the corridor, giving her the 15 feet of distance she needed to reassemble herself in, and he did it so quickly and so completely that she understood he had been waiting for the instruction and would have obeyed any version of it. The supplements on the second shelf, bound in blue. "I'll be in the passage at 9. It was 9:10 when she came down. She had spent the extra 10 minutes in a cold lavatory with her hands braced on the basin, and she had not managed much, and she had come anyway. He was in the west passage exactly as he was every morning, and the ward pressure was gathering, and the black oak stood with its stone eye blind and waiting. He put his palm to the disc. It went the orange of a breathed coal. The door gave 4 inches, and the archive's dry mineral breath came out into the damp, and then came the pause, the inch of held air, the raised hand, the weight, and Hermione did not nod. She stood in front of him with her satchel strap cutting her shoulder, and her eyes red-rimmed, and she did not give him the small, brisk nod she had given him 30-odd times, and for 2 full seconds neither of them breathed. "We can leave it," Draco said quietly. "Today. There's no law that says the archive has to be open. There's a bill. The bill will keep a day. The bill will not keep a day. The 3rd reading is in January, and I have 4 counties left." She was aware that her voice had gone thin, and that she was talking about parliamentary procedure in order not to talk about anything else, and she was aware that he knew it. "Do it. Please, just do it, and let me go in, and I'll be perfectly all right once I'm working. I'm not going to do it while you're standing like that." "Like what?" "Like a woman at a wall," said Draco, waiting for the order. That went into her somewhere very deep and very old. She put her hand out, blind, unplanned, and it landed on the front of his coat, on the wool over his ribs, fisted in it, and she held on. She did not look up. She stood in a stone passage in the house that had eaten a year of her sleep, and held on to a handful of Draco Malfoy's coat with her forehead nearly at his collarbone, and she breathed, and he did not move a muscle. He did not put his arms round her. She understood, even then, in the middle of it, that this was a decision he was making, and that it was costing him. She could feel the tension singing in him under the wool, the whole body held rigid in the discipline of not touching, and that he was not going to lay a hand anywhere on her that had not been documented, signed, dated and consented to in triplicate. Not today of all days, not in this house. The forms. God. The absurd, ludicrous, life-saving forms. She had built that wall to keep him out. He had climbed up it and made himself a sentry. "All right," she said into his coat. "All right." She let go. She stepped back. She straightened her cuffs, both of them, twice, and lifted her chin. "Go on," she said. "I'm ready." He raised his hand and held it that inch away and waited, and she nodded, and his palm came down over her heart. And it was different. It was so different that she nearly said something and did not, and spent the rest of her life glad she hadn't. His hand was not flat and dutiful and correct. It had settled, the fingers spread and easy, the heel of it resting warm against her sternum, the whole weight of it given rather than placed, the way a hand rests on something it means to keep. The ring bit its cold half-moon. Under his palm, her heart was going like a hare, and he did not pretend otherwise. She felt his thumb move, once, the smallest possible stroke against the wool over her collarbone. And it was not an accident, and it was not in Schedule 4, and neither of them ever filed an amendment for it. "Ex ver vid jörd och stein och blod," he said, and his voice had gone rough at the edges. "Oke vid hjarta eidsvarans, at hon fari in och ut I fridi." 15 seconds. 16. Long past what the wards required, long past the moment the stone disc had flared white and the hinges had given, the two of them stood in a cold passage with his hand on her chest and the door standing open on 800 years of paper, and neither one of them moved to end it. The trouble with being a person who kept records was that the records kept you back. Hermione had 31 days of them by then. She had the transcription log, every document, every date, every hour in and hour out, ruled in her own hand and initialed in the margin. She had the running tally of counties. She had the interleaved notes on translation and the separate notebook for the bill's drafting, and the small red book she had used since school for anything that did not have another book. And at the back of the drawer in the Cold Inn at Marlborough, under the folded triplicate copies that were hers to keep, she now had a fourth thing. It had begun as a joke. She was almost certain it had begun as a joke. A Tuesday evening, rain on the leaded window, her feet numb, a glass of very bad sherry the landlady insisted on providing free to guests staying above a fortnight, and Hermione had pulled a fresh sheet towards her and written across the top in her tidiest hand, Form 12-B, Amendment, Schedule 4. And then she had sat with her quill up and looked at it. Duration of contact, the annex asked. State in seconds or by reference to a defined procedure. She had written, duration to be determined by the completion of the oath. Then she had crossed it out because the oath had been completing itself for weeks and the hand had gone on staying. She had written, duration as required, crossed out. Required by what? She had written finally in a hand that was not tidy at all, duration at the discretion of the parties. And she had put the quill down as though it had gone hot in her fingers and sat back and looked at the sentence she had made and understood with total clarity that there was no version of this document that was about the wards. Nature of contact, said the next box. She did not fill it in. She could not have filled it in at one point. She folded the sheet in half and put it under the triplicate copies and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening to the rain and thinking about a thumb moving once across her collarbone and the fact that he had not apologized for it and the fact that she had not wanted him to. She took the amendment out again the next night, and the next. She never added a word to it. It became a thing she did, the way other people took a drink. Unfold it, read the 4 lines, fold it, put it away. He noticed the parchment on the 11th of November. He had come down with the tray at 1, and she had been at the far end of the vault with the Herefordshire boxes. And by the time she came back up the aisle with her arms full, he was standing at the end stand, quite still, looking at the corner of a folded sheet protruding from between the leaves of her transcription log. She had not meant to bring it. She had put it in the log to keep it flat, and then she had not taken it out, and she had carried it into his house 4 mornings running, like a woman carrying a lit candle into a hayloft. He did not touch it. That was the thing. His hands stayed exactly where they were, one on the tray's rim, and he looked at the corner of that parchment, at the ruled heading, at the fragment of her handwriting visible above the fold, at the crossings out, for perhaps 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds too long for a man who was not reading. Then he moved the teapot an inch to the left, for no reason at all, and said, "The Hereford boxes are damp at the bottom. The mill charter's foxed. Don't let it near a lamp. It'll take." "I know how to handle a foxed charter." "I'm sure you do." He poured 2 cups. He had never once stopped bringing 2. She set down her armful and sat and did not move the log and did not push the parchment back in, because to do it now would be to announce it. And she thought, with the cold competence she brought to bad situations. If I do nothing, it is nothing. Draco sat down on the stool opposite, which he had begun doing on the 24th day and had never remarked upon. "You've 4 counties left," he said. 3. Devon closed yesterday. Then you'll be done by the end of the month. The 23rd, if the Cheshire boxes are indexed the way the concordance says. The 27th, if they aren't. She heard her own voice give a small, unauthorized movement on the numbers and covered it by turning a page. "Which they won't be. Your great-grandfather was accurate about everything except Cheshire, for reasons I have decided not to investigate. He lost a lawsuit in Chester in 1863. That would do it. It was about a bridge. Of course it was." He was smiling. Not the old thing, the pulled tight thing she remembered from a corridor at 14. Something smaller and more dangerous, present only at one corner of the mouth and in the skin beside the eyes. She had been watching it develop for a fortnight, the way one watches a slow chemical process, with interest and a certain amount of alarm. "The 23rd, Draco said. "Or the 27th. "Yes." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the saucer, and then the schedule expires. The vault was very quiet. 70 feet of dry stone and 800 years of paper standing in the racks, and nothing at all moving in it. "It expires on the 23rd of November regardless," Hermione said. "That's what I put on the form. I put 6 weeks. You did. It was an estimate. It was a very precise estimate. You wrote the day of the week in brackets afterwards." He did not look up from the cup. "Tuesday." She had written Tues in her own hand at the bottom of Schedule 4 in a moment of pure administrative reflex. And now the word sat between them in the cold, like something dropped and not picked up. "You said," she began and had to steady it, "on the first day. You said if it ran long, you'd sign an extension, that I needn't apply again." "I did say that. Did you mean it?" Draco set the cup down. When he looked up, whatever had been at the corner of his mouth had gone entirely. "Granger," he said, "I would sign an extension for the archive on a fortnight's notice, a day's notice, or none at all. I would sign one at 3 in the morning in the rain. If you turn up on the 24th of November with 3 counties left, or with no counties left, and a bad excuse about a bridge in Chester, I will be in that passage at 9 o'clock, and you know that perfectly well, and you have known it for a month." He picked up the tray. "But you will have to be the one to bring me the form. I'm not going to draft it. There are limits to what a man can do with a quill without it being a question. And I'm not going to ask you a question you haven't given me leave to ask." He went. He got 4 paces up the aisle. "Malfoy." He stopped, but he did not turn round, and afterwards she thought that had been a mercy, because it let her say it to the back of his coat. "What if I don't bring it?" The lamps hissed. Somewhere far off, water was still working at the plaster of a ceiling 3 floors up. Then, on the 23rd of November, Draco said, "At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I will swear you out of this room for the last time, and I will walk you to the gate, and I will thank you for your work on the bill, and I will go back into the house." A pause of perhaps a second and a half. "And I will not stand at the window." "You'd stand at the window." "I would stand at the window," he agreed, "but I want it on record that I intend not to." And he went up the aisle and out through the low black door. And Hermione sat down slowly on the stool with her hand flat on the cover of the transcription log, on the ridge where the folded parchment lay inside it. And she found she was pressing hard enough to feel the fold through the leather. She got as far as the ministry with it. Wednesday, the 12th of November, a raw morning, the atrium's fountain running with rain-cold water, the queue at level 2's fourth window, 14 people long and moving at the speed of geology. She stood in it with the amendment in her coat pocket and rehearsed. I require an extension to the Schedule 4 Annex on 12-B, reference M-4471. Yes, open-ended. No fixed terminus. Nature of contact. She got to the front of the queue. The clerk was a tired man with a boil on his neck and a stamp in each hand. Yes, I need, said Hermione. He waited. Behind her, someone shifted their weight and sighed. She was going to have to write it in the box. That was the thing she had not fully reckoned with until she was standing at the counter with the man's quill turned towards her. There was a box on the amendment, and the box said, Nature of Contact, and the original had said official business in a beautiful, ferocious, absolutely level hand. And whatever she wrote in that box today would sit in a file in the Department of Magical Antiquities for 400 years, and there was no word available to her that was both true and survivable, because it was not official business. It had not been official business since the 8th day at the very latest, and possibly not since the 1st, and she had 32 mornings of evidence in her own handwriting, proving that a woman who arrives 10 minutes early for a procedure she claims to tolerate is a woman lying in a log. Madam? Nothing, Hermione said. I'm sorry. I've come to the wrong window. She walked out through the atrium with the amendment still folded in her pocket, and she went back to Wiltshire, and she was in the West Passage at 9 o'clock the next morning with her satchel and her wrecked boots, and Draco Malfoy was in the doorway, and he looked at her for slightly longer than usual and said nothing at all about London. He put his palm to the stone. The disc flushed. The door gave. He raised his hand and held it that inch away, and she nodded, and it settled. Warm, spread, given, the ring cold at her sternum, and her heart went off underneath it like a bird flushed out of long grass, and this time she did not even pretend to look at the door. Ek sver vid jord, ok stein, ok blod. He was reciting it from memory now. He had stopped needing the parchment somewhere around the 20th day, and she had noticed and had said nothing. And today, for the first time, she let herself watch his mouth make the words, the archaic shapes of them, the small, unhurried care he took with a language nobody in Britain had spoken in 8 centuries. And she understood, standing in that cold passage with her whole chest full of her own pulse, that in 11 days it would stop, and that she had 11 days to find a word for the box. The snow came on the 19th. It had been threatening all week. A hard white sky, the elms gone to bare wire, the puddles in the drives skinned over each morning, with ice that broke under her boots like sugarwork. Then, on the Wednesday afternoon, the light changed to the colour of tin, and the first flakes came down past the archive's one high grating, and Hermione, 70 feet underground in a stone vault with no weather in it, did not know a thing about it until nearly midnight. The Cheshire boxes had beaten her, as predicted. 12 of them, indexed by nothing recognizable to man or ministry, and inside them the whole tangled misery of the northern conveyances. Land taken under one name, registered under another, sold on twice within a decade to launder the provenance. She had been at it since 9 that morning. She had eaten nothing since the tray. She had 4 transcriptions left, and a hand that had gone into a claw round the quill, and a growing conviction that if she stopped now, she would lose the thread and never find it again. The bell pull hung at the far end by the stair, and she did not go near it. At some point, after 10, the lamps needed feeding, and she said Kavike to them without looking up. At some point, after 11, her back gave a warning, and she ignored it. Somewhere near midnight, she reached the last box, and the last box held the thing she had been chasing for 6 weeks without knowing it existed. A schedule of 41 Cheshire holdings, with the names of the families, and beside each name a column-headed disposition, and beside each disposition a date. She read it 3 times. Then she put both hands flat on the stand and lowered her head, and stayed like that. "That's the one, then." He was in the doorway. He was in the doorway in his shirt sleeves with his collar undone and a lamp in his hand, and she had no idea how long he had been standing there. "What time is it?" 20 past 12. "That isn't possible." "It's snowing," Draco said. 4 inches on the terrace and coming down like the end of the world. "You can't apparate out in it, and I wouldn't let you if you could." He came down the 2 steps into the vault. He had done it perhaps 6 times in 6 weeks, and never after dark, and set the lamp on the end stand. "You didn't ring." "I didn't notice." "Evidently." He looked at the schedule under her hands. 41, 41, with dates. Her voice had gone strange and thin from 6 hours of disuse. "Malfoy, the ministry has 9 of these on record. 9. The rest simply, the families are still there. Some of them. There are Ashworths in Herefordshire now. There are people alive who don't know their grandmother's farm was." She stopped, because her voice had cracked straight down the middle. He did not say anything comforting. She was grateful to him for it for years afterwards. He pulled up the second stool and sat down at the corner of the stand, an arm's length away, and looked at the schedule for a long moment, and then said, "The 3rd column. That hand's my great-uncle Cassius." He kept a separate ledger for anything he thought might one day be examined, and it's in the 5th bay behind the map case, and I'll get it for you in the morning. "There's a separate ledger?" "There's always a separate ledger," said Draco. "That's what the families like mine were actually for." Hermione laughed. It came out of her cracked and unlovely and entirely involuntary, and once it started, she could not stop it, and it turned into something with a wet edge that she cut off hard with the back of her wrist. "I'm very tired," she said, by way of explanation. I had gathered. "I'm going to keep working." "You're going to eat something first," he said, "and then you're going to keep working, because I know better than to suggest anything else, and there's a room made up at the top of the west stair for whenever you fall over, which will be at approximately 2. 3:30. 2, said Draco, "and I'll wager on it." He was wrong. It was 3:10 when she finally set the quill down, and by then the snow had made the whole house strange. She had not been upstairs in the manor after dark in her life, unless you counted a night 3 years ago that she had spent a great deal of money and effort not counting. Now she went up the west stair behind him with a lamp in her hand and found that the place had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The snow was doing it, packing the roofs, filling the gutters, muffling everything, until the house had no sound in it at all except their own footsteps and, far off, the tick of a long case clock with a lazy escapement. He stopped at a door on the second landing. "It's aired. There's a fire lit. There's a bolt on the inside, and it's a good one. I checked it myself this afternoon." She looked at him. "You made this up this afternoon," she said, "before the snow. The barometer's been falling since Monday. You made up a room and lit a fire and checked the bolt on Monday's barometer." "I have very little else to do," said Draco Malfoy, "as you may have observed." He turned to go, and she said his name, and he stopped with his hand on the newel post. "9 o'clock's going to be a farce," she said. "There'll be 3 feet against the west door." "There will. So there's no point my going out, only to come back in." "No point at all. Which means," she said carefully, "that I don't need swearing out tomorrow, or in." He stood in the dark of the landing with the lamp throwing his shadow up the panelling, and neither of them said anything, and the clock somewhere below them ticked its uneven tick, and the snow went on packing itself against the windows. "No," he said at last, "you don't." "Right," said Hermione. "Good. Obviously that's more efficient. Considerably. Good night, Malfoy. Good night, Granger." She bolted the door. She lay in a strange bed in the house that had furnished 100 of her worst nights. In front of a fire someone had banked for her at 4 in the afternoon on the strength of a falling barometer, and she stared at the canopy above her and thought, "I don't need swearing in tomorrow, and I am lying here calculating whether I could construct a reason to be sworn in anyway." She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she slept until 9:30 and woke without the singing in her arm for the first time in 3 years in that house, and lay very still with her hand over her own sternum where the ring would have been. The snow held them for 2 days. They were the 2 days that did the damage. She was clear about that afterwards, sorting the whole thing into its causes the way she sorted anything. 6 weeks of 11 seconds a day had built the thing. The snow simply took away every excuse either of them had for not looking at it. There was no ritual because there was no gate to pass. The archive stood open behind them, sworn wide, unbothered. There was no schedule. There was no apparition point at the end of the drive with a woman walking towards it at 4:30. There were 2 people and a very large cold house and 41 Cheshire holdings, and they worked in the vault side by side because there was no reason not to. And he read Cassius's ledger aloud in his flat, unhurried voice while she wrote, and twice she laughed at something he said before she had decided whether she was going to. On the second evening, they ate in the kitchen because the dining room was, in his phrase, a mausoleum with a table in it, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house on account of a range that had been alight since 1740. It had a scrubbed elm table with 200 years of knife marks in it. It had a dresser with mismatched plates. It had, Hanging over the range on a hook, a copper pan that had clearly not been cleaned since the last elf left. And Hermione looked at it, and then at him, and said nothing. And he said, "I know." And she said, "I didn't say anything." And he said, "You looked at the pan." And something in her chest turned over. They talked about the bill, then about Chester and the bridge, and Cassius, who had apparently been the only Malfoy in 3 centuries to be genuinely, spectacularly bad at money. Then about nothing, about the snow and the sound the elms made under it, and whether the barometer could be trusted at all, or was simply an ornament that had been right once by accident. At some point, she realized she had been talking for 11 minutes about her parents. She had not meant to. It had come sideways out of something about Australia, and she had heard herself doing it and had not stopped. And Draco had put his chin on his hand and listened without once making the face people made. The soft, ruined, pitying face that meant she would have to spend the next 10 minutes managing them. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Did they know you?" he asked. "At the end, when you brought them back?" "My mother did, not straight away." She turned her glass a half turn on the elm. "My father took 11 months. He knew my name for 11 months before he knew me. And I sat in that house every Sunday and let a man who thought I was a nice young woman from the practice make me a cup of tea. That's obscene. It was necessary." "Both things can be true," said Draco. "Most of the worst things are both." She looked up at him across the table in a kitchen made yellow by lamplight and a range that had outlived every family that ever fed it. And she thought, quite calmly, "I am going to be in trouble over this man." The thaw came on Saturday. She apparated home from the gate on Saturday afternoon with her transcriptions shrunk in her satchel, and she was back at 9 on Monday morning because there were 2 counties left and 8 days on Schedule 4. And on Monday morning, it began again. The West Passage, the pressure, the palm on the stone, the disc going coal red. And Hermione understood, standing there with the cold coming off the black oak, that both of them now knew it was theatre. He raised his hand and held it that inch away. She nodded. His palm settled over her heart, and the ring made its small, cold half-moon, and he began the oath, and he took it slowly. He took it very slowly. He had been taking it slowly for a fortnight, and this morning he took it slower still, letting each dead syllable sit in the air of that passage for a full beat longer than it needed, and the stone disc went white after 14 seconds, and the hinges gave and the door swung wide onto the archive. And he did not take his hand away. The wards were satisfied. The door stood open. There was no reason on earth for his palm to still be on her chest, and it was, and neither of them looked at the doorway, and Hermione heard her own heart under his hand going hard enough that she thought it must be audible in the stone. "Malfoy," she said. "Yes. The door's open. I'm aware. You've been slowing it down." His eyes came up and met hers, and there was nothing careful left in them at all. "Yes," said Draco. "I have." Neither of them moved. The archive stood open behind him, wide, breathing its dry mineral cold into the passage. The wards were satisfied and had gone quiet. That faint charge in the air had dropped away entirely, leaving nothing between them but stone and damp and the ordinary morning. And in that ordinary morning, Draco Malfoy's hand was still lying flat over Hermione Granger's heart, with no legal, magical, or documented reason to be there. "How long?" she said. "How long what?" "How long have you been slowing it down?" He did not take his hand away. She noticed that he had stopped pretending to. She noticed, too, that his palm had gone warm through the wool of her jumper and that her whole chest had organized itself round that warmth like iron filings round a magnet. "The wards want 11 seconds, Draco said. They wanted 11 seconds on the 12th of October, and they want 11 now. I have given them 14 since the beginning of November, 16 on the 9th, 17 on the day of the snow, and if you want the precise figure for this morning, I would put it at 19, though I confess I stopped counting somewhere in the middle." "You counted." "I have counted every one of them since the 4th day," he said. "You keep a log. Did you imagine you were the only one?" She should have stepped back. That was the move. That was the only move available to a sensible woman with 2 counties left and a 3rd reading in January. She stood exactly where she was. "Why?" "Granger." "No, say it. You've had 6 weeks. Say it properly." "You know why. I want it in words." Her voice came out low and unsteady and furious with itself. "You have given me nothing but silence and tea and a room made up on a barometer. You have handed me every single thing except a sentence. And I am not going to stand here and construct one for you out of guesswork, because if I'm wrong about this, Malfoy, I don't get to walk out of that gate on the 23rd with my dignity. I get to walk out of it having invented an entire—" She stopped because his thumb had moved. Once, slow, across her collarbone, exactly as it had on the day of the drawing room, and the whole apparatus of her speech went out from under her like a stare in the dark. "Because I like it," Draco said, very quietly, not looking away. "Because I get one part of the day in which I am permitted to put my hand on you, and it is documented, and it is signed, and it is entirely above reproach, and nobody in the world can say I took anything I wasn't given. And because it is the only 11 seconds in 6 weeks in which I am not required to have a reason for standing this close to you." His hand did not move from her heart. Under it, hers was going hard enough to be an argument in itself. "And because you have known this since roughly the 2nd week, and you have gone on holding out your form and given me that small nod every morning at 9 o'clock, and letting me. So, no. I don't think I'm the only one who ought to be making sentences this morning." The passage held it. The house held it. Somewhere 3 floors up, the water was still working at the plaster. Tap, tap, patient as a clerk. Hermione took his wrist, not to push it away. She took it in her hand, the bones of it, the cuff, the warmth, and held it there against her chest for a second longer, deliberately, so that he would have to feel exactly what her heart was doing and know that she had made him feel it on purpose. Then she lifted his hand off and set it down between them and let go. "I have 2 counties left," she said. "I know. The bill has a 3rd reading in January, and there are 41 families in Cheshire alone who have never been told what was taken from them, and I have 8 working days. I know that too. Then you know why I can't do this now. Granger, I can't do it now." It came out of her with a violence that startled them both, and she heard it ring off the stone and come back doubled the way everything did in that house. If I stand in this passage and let you finish that, I will not read another word of Cheshire. Do you understand me? I know what I'm like. I have one thing in me at a time, and it takes the whole of me. And if I let this be the thing, then those 41 families wait another year, and another after that, because the bill after this one is the licensing amendment, and it will eat the entire spring. Draco stood very still. You've thought about it, he said. I have thought about nothing else since the 11th of November. That's a specific date. It's a specific date, she agreed. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not read at all, and then, of all things, he laughed. Once. Short and low and entirely without bitterness, a sound she had never heard out of him in her life. 8 days, he said. 8 days. And on the 23rd? On the 23rd I will have finished, said Hermione, and I will not have anything left to hide behind. And then you may say whatever you were going to say, and I will say whatever I am going to say, and we shall find out what happens. She straightened her cuffs twice and lifted her chin, and could not entirely keep her mouth from moving at the corner. Until then, Malfoy, you will kindly keep the oath to its proper length. 11 seconds. 11. That, said Draco Malfoy, is a monstrous thing to ask of a man. It's what the wards require. The wards, he said, are 800 years old and have no idea what they're doing. And he turned and went up the passage, and she watched him go with her hand pressed flat over the place where his had been. And then she went down into the vault and worked for 9 hours and got through less than half of what she'd planned. He kept it to 11 seconds. That was the thing that undid her in the end. She had half expected him to test it. A beat too long here, a look held there, some small dishonesty to keep the pot on the boil. He did none of it. For 8 days, he gave the wards precisely what the wards asked for, and not a syllable more. And every single morning at 9 o'clock, he raised his hand and held it that inch away and waited for her nod. And every afternoon at 4, he swore her out again with the clipped efficiency of a man reading a train timetable. And it was unbearable. She had not known that a thing could be taken away by being given exactly as promised. But by the 3rd day, she was counting the seconds again herself and finding them short and coming up out of the vault at 4 o'clock with a feeling in her chest like a held note cut off. On the 20th, she caught herself dawdling in the passage after he'd finished. Actually dawdling, actually inventing a business with the strap of her satchel, and looked up to find him watching her with one eyebrow very slightly raised and the whole of his face otherwise perfectly innocent. Something wrong with the buckle? The buckle is fine. Only you've been at it a while. The buckle, said Hermione, is entirely fine, thank you, and went into the archive and heard him say behind her in a tone that ought to have been actionable. She worked. God, she worked. Cassius's second ledger gave up everything it had. The 41 Cheshire holdings and their true prices, the names of the magistrates paid, a marginal running total in galleons that made her feel physically ill. And she copied it all in a hand that got smaller and faster and worse. And she stopped only when Draco appeared at 1 o'clock with the tray, and again when he appeared at 4 with the oath. 2 cups still. He had never once broken it. On the 21st, she found the last thing. It was not a conveyance. It was a letter, tucked into the backboard of the ledger where the binding had come loose, dated 1871, from a Malfoy she'd never heard of to a solicitor in Chester. And it consisted of 4 lines instructing him to make certain no descendant of the Cheshire families should ever be told what had been done, the difficulty being not the law, but the memory of it, which outlives every writ. She sat with that for a long time. Then she got up and walked the length of the vault and pulled the bell twice, and when he came down the 2 steps, she said, without preamble, "I want to name your family in the bill." Draco stopped. "Explain." "Schedule 2 lists the estates from which restitution is drawn. I could keep it general. Precedence on my side. The Blacks were handled anonymously. So were the Selwyns. The Wizengamot prefers it. It moves faster. Nobody has to be looked at." She had her arms folded, and she was holding her own elbows hard enough to leave marks. "Or I name Malfoy, in the schedule, in the record, where it will sit for 400 years, and where every Ashworth in Herefordshire and every one of those 41 families in Cheshire can read it and know exactly whose hands it came out of." The lamps hissed. He looked at the letter in her hand and then at her. "Which do you want?" "That is not the question I asked you." "No," Draco said. "It's the one I'm asking." "I want to name you," she said. "I want it named." "This?" She lifted the 1871 letter. "Is a man paying a solicitor to make sure nobody remembers, and I am not going to put my name to a bill that finishes his work for him with better manners. But it's your house. It's your mother. It will be in every paper in Britain, and it will follow you for the rest of your life. And I am not." Her voice went, and she dragged it back. "I am not going to do that to you without asking, and I hate that I care whether I do it to you, and I have hated it for about a fortnight." Draco Malfoy crossed the vault and took the letter out of her hand and read it twice. Then he set it down on the stand, very precisely, and said, "Name it. Malfoy. Name it. In the schedule. Put the estate, put the years, put Cassius, and put whoever wrote that. And if the prophet want a photograph of me standing at my own gate under a headline about it, they may have one, and I'll wear a decent coat." He was not looking at her. His knuckles had gone white along the edge of the stand, 4 small bloodless points, and she looked at them and thought about the first time she had ever noticed them do that. "You've spent 6 weeks in a cold room under my house, dragging 300 years of it into daylight 1 page at a time. You are not going to do that, and then write a certain Wiltshire family in the schedule to spare my feelings. Not with my paper, not with my Norse. It will cost you everything you've spent 3 years building. It will cost me the good opinion of people whose good opinion is worth nothing," said Draco. "And it will give 41 families in Cheshire a name to say. That isn't a hard sum. I could do it drunk." Hermione discovered she had put her hand out and taken hold of the front of his coat again. The same handful of wool, the same blind reflex, the second time in 6 weeks, and that this time she was not hiding her face in it. She was looking straight up at him, close enough to see the grey light of the vault in his eyes, close enough that his breath moved. 2 days, she said. 2 days. Thursday, the 23rd. Tuesday, actually. No, Thursday. She was aware that she had entirely lost the thread of the calendar, and that it did not matter. "When I finish." "When you finish," Draco agreed, and his hand came up, slowly, giving her every chance in the world to stop it, and did not go to her heart at all, but to the side of her face, the backs of his fingers just brushing along her jaw, cold silver at the knuckle, the smallest possible contact, and nothing at all like an oath. "Nature of contact," she said unevenly. "Undocumented," said Draco Malfoy, and took his hand away and went up the aisle before either of them could ruin it. She finished at 6:07 on Thursday evening. There was no ceremony to it. That was what surprised her. She had imagined some sensation of arrival, and instead there was only the last line of the last transcription, a date and a county and a sum in galleons, and her quill lifting off the page, and the small dry sound of the nib coming away from the paper in a room that had no other sound in it at all. Hermione sat and looked at it. 6 weeks, 411 documents, 41 Cheshire holdings, and 19 in Herefordshire, and the whole rotten northern chain from 1683 to 1871, copied in her own hand, initialed in the margin, ready for a clerk in London who would never know what it had cost to get it. She had thought she would cry. She didn't. She stacked the sheets and squared them against the stand and tied them with the tape she had brought from the ministry on the very first morning. And then she sat with her hands flat on the bundle for a while, and the lamps hissed, and 800 years of paper stood silent in the racks around her. Then she went to the far end of the vault and pulled the bell twice. He was in the passage in under 2 minutes, which meant he had not been anywhere near the drawing room or the west stair or any of the places a man might reasonably be at 6 in the evening. It meant he had been within 30 yards of that door, waiting, and had probably been there for hours. She came up the 2 steps with the bundle under her arm and stopped in front of him. "Done," she said. Draco looked at the tape round the papers. Something went across his face too fast to catch. "All of it?" "All of it. Cheshire, Hereford, the Cumberland deeds, Cassius's second ledger, 411 documents." Her voice did something complicated on the number. "It goes to the drafting office on Monday. Schedule 2 names the estate." "Good. You can still..." "Granger," he said, "if you offer me an opportunity to change my mind one more time, I shall take it very badly. Name it." "It's named." "Then it's done." He put his palm flat to the stone disc without being asked, and the wards drew in around them, and the archive breathed its dry cold at their backs, and he raised his right hand and held it that inch away from her and waited, and Hermione looked at the space where his hand was not. "That's the last one," she said. "It is. Schedule 4 expires at midnight." "It does." "You could refuse to swear me out," she said. "I'd have to stay." There was a silence in the passage of perhaps 2 seconds. "Don't," said Draco, low. "Say things like that to me at 6 o'clock in the evening on the 23rd of November. She nodded, the small brisk nod, the 84th of them, and his palm came down over her heart, and it was the last time it would ever be legal, and he took it slowly. He took the whole thing slowly, all of it, every dead syllable of an oath 800 years old, spoken low into the cold between them while the stone went white and the hinges gave, and her heart went off underneath his hand, exactly as it had on the 12th of October, no calmer, Not by a single beat, not one. At Honfari in ok ut I fridi, the wards released. His hand stayed a moment longer than it needed to. Then it came away, and he stepped back and cleared his throat and said in an entirely level voice, "There's wine." "What?" "In the kitchen. There's wine." He was already turning. "The vineyard outside Saint-Emilion. My mother's side had it from her grandmother, and it makes about 40 cases a year, and nobody drinks it because nobody's here. I brought a cask up from the cellar in October." A pause. "On the 12th of October, in point of fact. It's been sitting in the kitchen for 6 weeks looking at me." "You brought up a cask on the first day." "I brought up a cask on the first day," said Draco Malfoy, "because I am an optimist and a fool, and I have had 6 weeks to consider which of those it was, and I still don't know." The kitchen at 8 o'clock had gone gold at the edges. The range had been alight since 1740, and it was alight now. The copper pan still hung uncleaned on its hook. The scrubbed elm table carried 200 years of knife marks and a bottle that had been decanted out of the cask an hour before. The wine was almost black in the lamplight. It tasted of stone fruit and dust, and something faintly like wood smoke, and it was very old and very good, and it went to her head with the efficiency of a well-drafted clause. They had toasted the bill, then the 41 families. Then Cassius, out of pure ridiculousness, because Cassius had lost a lawsuit about a bridge and had thereby ruined the Cheshire Index for 160 years, and somewhere in the middle of explaining this, Hermione had put her head down on the table and laughed until her ribs hurt. Draco was not drunk in any way that showed in his speech. It showed everywhere else. It showed in the loosened collar and the coat over the back of the chair, and the way he had stopped arranging his hands. It showed most of all in the fact that he had given up, entirely and visibly, on the 6-week discipline of not looking at her. He was looking at her now. He had been looking at her for some time. She had been aware of it for perhaps a quarter of an hour, aware of it the way one is aware of a fire in a room, as a source of heat that does not need to be checked to be known. And she had gone on talking about the third reading and the licensing amendment, and had let him look. Then his eyes went down and stopped, and did not come back up for a full second. He caught himself. She watched him catch himself. She watched him drag his gaze up to her face and go slightly grey around the mouth and reach for his glass with the desperate composure of a man who has just walked into a doorframe in company. "Malfoy." "Yes." "You're staring at my chest." "I'm aware of what I'm doing, Granger. Thank you. I have a working knowledge of my own." He set the glass down, hard enough to ring. "I have had my hand on you every day for 6 weeks with a form to justify it. The form expired 4 hours ago. I am now a man in a kitchen with no paperwork whatsoever, and rather too much of a wine that was bottled before either of us was born, and I would take it as a very great kindness if you did not narrate me to myself. 16 years of narrating you to yourself. I'm not stopping now." "No," he said. "I don't suppose you are." The range ticked. Outside, the elms moved. Hermione stood up. She did it without deciding to, the way she had taken hold of his coat twice in 6 weeks, and she came round the corner of the table and stood in front of his chair, and he sat back and looked up at her and did not move a single muscle. "Do you know what I did on the 11th of November?" she said. "You went to the ministry. How do you—" "You came back at 9 the next morning with your jaw set like a woman who had lost an argument with a stranger. I assumed a clerk." His voice had dropped somewhere low and rough. "I have had 6 weeks of watching you at 9 o'clock in the morning. There is very little that gets past me now." "I went to level 2, Hermione said. "4th window. I stood in a queue for 50 minutes with an amendment to Schedule 4 in my coat pocket. Open-ended, no terminus." She was aware that her hands were shaking and that she had stopped caring. "And I got to the front, and the clerk turned his quill towards me, and I couldn't write in the box. The nature of contact box. I stood there, and I could not think of a single word that was both true and something I could say out loud in a public corridor in the Ministry of Magic. And so I said I'd come to the wrong window, and I walked out, and I have carried that piece of parchment in my satchel every day since. Do you have it now?" "It's in the satchel by the door." Draco's hand had gone white along the arm of the chair. "Granger," he said, "if you have carried an unfiled amendment into my house for 12 consecutive days, I would very much like to know what you were waiting for." "I was waiting for 2 counties," she said, "and I finished them." And she reached down and took his right hand, the heavy silver signet, the long cold fingers, the hand that had been laid over her heart 84 times under the authority of a green form, and she brought it up and pressed it flat against her chest, over her heart, where it belonged, undocumented, unsigned, nobody's business at all. His breath went out of him as though he'd been struck. "There," she said. Her own voice had gone to almost nothing. "Feel that. It has been doing that since the 12th of October. It did it on the first morning, and you must have known, and you never said one word. And it has done it every single day for 6 weeks. And I have written in a log that I was habituating Malfoy in ink, like a scientist, like a fool." He was on his feet. She had not seen him rise. The chair went back over the flags with a scrape, and he was standing, and his hand had not left her, and his other hand had come up to her jaw, and they were an inch apart in a kitchen made yellow by a range that had outlived every family that had ever fed it. "Say it," he said. "You say it. I said it in a stone passage 8 days ago, and you told me to keep to 11 seconds. Then say it again." "I want you," said Draco Malfoy, "in a manner that has not been official business since approximately the 4th of November, and I have filled out every form in the Ministry of Magic to avoid having to admit it, and I would fill out 400 more if it meant one more morning of you standing in that passage waiting to give me that damned little nod." Hermione took a breath that shook the whole length of her. "Is there a ritual," she said, "for getting into your bedroom?" The sound he made was not a word. And then he was kissing her, or she was kissing him. Neither of them ever settled it, and both of them argued about it for years. And it was not gentle, and it was not slow, and it was 6 weeks of 11 seconds arriving all at once. His hand slid from her jaw into her hair, and the other stayed exactly where she had put it, flat and warm over her heart, and she got a fist in his shirt and pulled, and her back met the edge of the elm table, and something on it went over. The glass, she thought later, the glass and possibly a plate, and neither of them so much as paused. She tasted the wine on him, stone fruit and dust and wood smoke, and something underneath it that was only him. And she made a sound against his mouth that she would have died to hear from anyone else, and his hand at her heart finally moved. "No forms," he said, against her jaw, her throat, the hinge of it. "Say it. Say there are no forms. No forms. No triplicate. No triplicate, Malfoy, for the love of God." "Draco." She got her hands either side of his face and made him look at her. "Draco," she said. He picked her up off the flagstones as though she weighed nothing at all, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, and the kitchen door banged open against the dresser hard enough to rattle every mismatched plate on it, and the range went on ticking in an empty room with a chair on its back and a spilled glass running slow and dark across 200 years of knife marks in the elm. The west stair was long. They did not manage it quickly. Twice she was pressed against the panelling with his mouth at her throat, and once he stopped dead 3 steps from the top because she had got her hand inside his shirt, flat against his ribs, over his heart, and held it there. And he leaned his forehead against hers and stood absolutely still in the dark with the whole house silent around them, and let her feel exactly what it was doing. "Well," Hermione said unsteadily, "that's rather worse than mine." "Considerably worse," said Draco. "It has been considerably worse since the day of the snow, and I would appreciate it if you would stop taking readings and come to bed." She woke because the light was wrong. Not bad. Wrong. Coming from the left instead of the right, and low and gold, the particular thin gold of a November morning after frost, laid in long bars across an unfamiliar ceiling. For perhaps 4 seconds, Hermione Granger did not know where she was, and in those 4 seconds, her body ran through its usual inventory and found, to its considerable astonishment, nothing to be afraid of. Then the arm across her waist tightened very slightly, and she remembered everything at once. She lay still. The room was enormous and almost entirely bare. He had done to this one what he had done to the other, she realized, stripped it back to a bed and a chair and a wardrobe and a fireplace with last night's ashes going grey in it. There were no portraits. There was a window with the shutters folded back, and beyond it the elms standing in white, every branch furred with frost, and beyond them the fields going away pale and silver towards a horizon the colour of milk. Draco was asleep against her shoulder, with his hair in complete disorder, and his mouth slightly open, and one hand splayed flat across her sternum, over her heart, in his sleep, without an oath, without a form, without so much as waking up to do it. Hermione put her hand over his, and lay there in the frost light, and discovered that she was crying, quite silently, in a way that had nothing whatever to do with grief. "If you're about to be sensible," he said into her shoulder without opening his eyes, "I would ask you to hold it until after breakfast." "I'm not being sensible. You've gone very still. In my limited but intense experience of you, that means you're drafting." "I'm not drafting." "Granger." "I'm looking at the frost," she said, "and thinking that I have woken up in this house 11 times now, and this is the first morning I haven't checked where the door is." His eyes opened. He propped himself up on one elbow and looked down at her for a long moment, and there was nothing careful left in his face at all. None of the flat, disciplined, doorway-standing composure she had spent 6 weeks reading like a hostile document. He looked about 19. He looked ruined and delighted and slightly frightened, which he suspected was an accurate description of her own face, and which he therefore chose not to think about. "Say that again," he said. "I didn't check the door." "No." He shook his head slightly. "The other thing, 11 times. I've counted every night I've slept in this house." "So have I," said Draco. "2 before last night, and I sat up for both of them." "You what?" "Not outside your room. Nothing so pathetic." He lay back down, on his side, facing her, and his hand found her heart again with the absent-minded certainty of 6 weeks of practice. "In the library, below. It's directly under the room I put you in, and you can hear the floor move. I wanted to know whether you slept." A pause. "The first night you were up until nearly 4. I heard the boards. I very nearly came up, and I have never been more glad of anything than that I didn't." "Why didn't you?" "Because there was no form for it," he said. "And because if I had knocked on that door at 4 in the morning in that house, I would have undone every single thing I had spent 5 weeks not doing." Hermione turned her face into the pillow for a moment. "You dreadful, careful man," she said thickly. "Yes. I'm going to say something, and you're not going to make it into a joke. I make no promises whatsoever before 9 o'clock. The forms," she said. "The forms were a wall. I built them to keep you out of me. And you got hold of the other side of them and used them to hold yourself back for 6 weeks, every day, without once telling me that was what you were doing." She turned her head and looked at him. "That's the thing I can't get past. Not last night. That." He was quiet for a while. The frost dripped somewhere off a gutter the first thaw of the morning. "There was one morning in the 2nd week," he said at last, "when you came down the drive in the rain without a hood on, and you were soaked through and furious about a train, and you stood in that passage and gave me your little nod, and I put my hand on you, and I thought very clearly in words I would fill out 1,000 of these." His thumb moved once across her collarbone, the same small motion, the one that had never been in Schedule 4. "And then I thought, that is not a thought a man has about official business. And I went upstairs, and I did not come down again until 1 o'clock. And when I did, I brought 2 cups. You'd been bringing 2 cups since the 9th day." "I know," said Draco. "I noticed on the 15th. That is how far behind my own hands I was." They came down at 11 and found the kitchen exactly as they had left it. The chair was still on its back. The glass had rolled to the edge of the elm and stopped there by some feat of engineering, and the wine had dried into the knife marks in a long, dark tributary system that Hermione suspected would never entirely come out. The range, which had not gone out since 1740, had not gone out. Draco set the chair on its feet. Hermione picked up the glass. Neither of them mentioned any of it, and both of them were smiling in a way that was frankly indecent for 2 adults in a kitchen before noon. He made eggs badly. She discovered, watching him do it, that Draco Malfoy could date a wax seal to within a decade and recite 800 years of Old Norse from memory, and could not, under any circumstances, be trusted with a pan. "That one's broken." "It is not broken. The yolk is... Malfoy, the yolk is everywhere. That is structurally a different food now." "Then it is a different food," he said, with enormous dignity. and you will eat it, and you will say it was excellent, because I have never made anyone breakfast in my life, and I intend to be encouraged." She ate it. It was terrible. She said it was excellent. It was afterwards, with the plates pushed aside and the second pot of tea going cold between them, that she pulled her satchel across the table and took out the folder. The oxblood leather, softened at the corners. The one he had handed her on the front step in the rain on the 13th of October, with everything inside completed in that ferocious, level, unvarying hand. "I've been thinking about procedure," Hermione said. That is the most alarming sentence in the English language. Form 12-B, Schedule 4, reference M-4471. She laid the sheets out on the elm, one after another, squaring each against the next. Duration and frequency of contact. It expired at midnight on the 23rd of November. It did. It is now the 24th. It is. "And you," said Hermione, "have had your hand on my chest more or less continuously since approximately 8 o'clock last night, which is—" She consulted an imaginary point in the air. 15 hours of undocumented contact, at least 3 separate categories, of which do not appear anywhere in ministry schedules, and one of which I am fairly sure has no name in the language. Draco leaned back in his chair and folded his arms and looked at her with open, undisguised joy. "Are you charging me?" "I'm noting an irregularity in the record. A serious one. Catastrophic," she said. "There is no consent in triplicate covering the staircase. There is nothing in Schedule 4 about the staircase at all. There is no annex governing." She stopped, went scarlet, and pressed on with the courage of a woman going over a parapet. "Governing any of it. And if this ever came before a records officer, I should have to resign." "Then I shall fill them in," said Draco. "All of them. This morning. Give me the reference numbers and I'll ride to London and stand in the queue at the 4th window myself, and I shall tell the man with the boil on his neck precisely what happened on the west stair." "You will do no such thing." "I will do exactly that, Granger. I have never been more serious." "Draco!" He stopped. She turned the last sheet round to face him. It was the amendment, the one she had drafted in a cold inn at Marlborough with a glass of bad sherry and carried in her satchel for 12 days and stood in a queue with for 50 minutes and never filed. The 4 lines, the crossings out, duration at the discretion of the parties, and the empty box. "There's a simpler solution," she said, "to the documentation problem." He looked at the box, then at her. "Is there?" "You said it yourself on the first morning. The wards admit the blood of the house without asking." Her hands were flat on the table, and she was holding them there by force. "They don't require an oath from a Malfoy. They never have. There's no form, no schedule, no annex, no clerk in London. A Malfoy simply walks in." The kitchen was extremely quiet. Draco Malfoy stood up. He came round the corner of the elm table and crouched down at the side of her chair so that he was looking up at her rather than down, which she thought later was the single most extraordinary thing he ever did, and he took her left hand in both of his. "I was going to do this at Christmas," he said. "I had an entire plan. It was very elaborate and it involved the vineyard, and I had written parts of it down." "You'd written it down?" "I write everything down. It is my one romantic gesture, and you have been benefiting from it since October." He turned her hand over and looked at the palm of it. "Move in first. That much I'd already decided to ask this morning, and I was going to dress it up as ritual efficiency, and you were going to see straight through it, and I was going to let you. Bring your books. Bring the appalling number of notebooks. There are 40 rooms, and I use 4 of them, and the library is the best one in England, and nobody has opened half those shutters since 1943. Draco?" "And then," he said, "when you are quite ready, and not one day before, because you have 411 documents going to a drafting office on Monday and a 3rd reading in January, and I know exactly what you are like, then you might consider whether you would care to be Mrs. Malfoy. In which case," and his mouth finally, helplessly, went up at the corner, "the wards would let you in on your own, and I would be out of a job, and there would be no ritual at all." Hermione Granger looked down at him for a long moment. Then she reached out with her free hand and took his right one. The heavy silver signet, the cold knuckle, the hand that had been laid over her heart 84 times under the authority of a green form, and once, last night, under no authority at all. And she pressed it flat against her chest. "Feel that," she said. "And then, tell me whether you think I need 8 weeks to consider it." Under his palm, her heart was going exactly as it had gone on the 12th of October, in a cold stone passage in the rain, hard, fast, and entirely without dignity. "Granger," he said, not steadily. "That's a yes, you dreadful, careful man. Obviously, that's a yes." And he came up off the floor and kissed her, and she caught his face in both hands and kissed him back, and the amendment with its empty box slid off the elm table and went under the dresser, where it stayed for 11 years until a house elf who did not exist yet failed to find it during a spring cleaning that never happened, because nobody in that kitchen ever went looking for it again. The Reparations Act passed its 3rd reading on the 19th of January. Schedule 2 named the estate. It named the years, and Cassius, and the solicitor in Chester, and the letter of 1871 was reproduced in full in the appendix, and the prophet ran the photograph of a fair-haired man standing at his own gates in a decent coat, and the headline was as bad as anyone could have wished. He kept the cutting. She found it years later in the back of the concordance, folded once, in the green book his great-grandfather had made, and she never asked him about it, and he never mentioned that she'd found it. In Herefordshire, a family called Ashworth received a letter from the ministry and did not believe it, and wrote back 3 times to check. And in a cold stone passage under the west wing of Malfoy Manor, on a Tuesday afternoon in the following spring, the archive door swung open for a woman who put her palm to the disc and walked in on her own authority, with nobody's hand on her heart at all, and stopped halfway down the aisle and turned round and said into the doorway, where a man was leaning with his arms folded and a tray of tea going cold beside him, "It's not the same, is it?" "No," said Draco. "It is not remotely the same." "Then get in here," said Mrs. Malfoy, "and say the words anyway." And he did, every dead syllable of it, unhurried, in a language nobody in Britain had spoken in 800 years, with his hand flat over her heart, in a room full of paper that could no longer keep her out. 19 seconds. Nobody was counting. Both of them were counting.
Hi everybody, we have a little update. We have a new kitty in our small family. His name is Fistache. Fistache. Thank you for listening. I want to say a few words. When I started this story, I thought it was a joke, a funny idea. A man has to put his hand on a woman's chest to open a door. She makes him fill out form first. That's a comedy, but then I wrote the forms, and something changed. There is a moment in part 2. Draco writes in the box, nature of contact, official business. 5 words. He wrote them so his hand would not shake. She read them so her heart would not. That's when I understood that his story was really about. It's about two people who are afraid, not of each other, of themselves. So they build walls. She builds hers out of paper, rules, signatures, triplicate copies. He built his out of silence. He never comes into the room. He stands in the doorway with a tray of tea and hears the strange things. Those walls saved them, because he never touched her without asking, not once. He waited for her small nod 84 times, and that waiting is what made her trust him. I thought about that a lot while I writing. We often think love is a big moment, a grand speech, a door breaking open. I don't think it is. I think love is small and boring and repeated. It is bringing 2 cups when nobody asked for 2. It is lighting a fire in a cold room on Monday because the barometer is falling and she might need it on Tuesday. Nobody sees those things, and they change everything. So if there is a lesson here, it is this. Watch what people do every day, not what they say once. And when someone waits for your permission every single time, that is not weakness, that is love learning your name slowly. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourselves.